Anyways, we will be tackling a special kind of bacteria, okay, for our lecture this afternoon in clinical microbiology. In general, objects in our world are described and recognized by the shapes that they possess. Okay? And the shapes are often described as geometric. When I say geometric, they are named as circles, squares, rectangles. So these are common terms in order to assign a name or to give a good description to physical objects in our finite world. If we transpose this to the world of bacteria, okay, this invisible world, okay, the world at the subcellular level, we have already learned that bacteria are classified also according to the shapes that they express. We have the rounded shaped bacteria, which we term as the coccus or the cocci. And then we have the elongated or the rod-shaped bacteria or the bacillus bacilli. But we still have a third class or category of bacteria. One that possesses a striking shape. A shape that is not static, it's not fixed. Rather, it is some sort of a kinetic type of bacteria, and then it has a distinctive shape in the form of a S or a spiral. Okay, and I think a spiral-shaped object is really an interesting item. Okay, we have lots of objects in our world that are spiral-shaped. They're even used as tools, okay, in our household. And I think there are some literary works whose theme is centered on the concept of spirals. Okay. So today we're going to learn about this distinct class of bacteria possessing a spiral or a helical shape. Okay. You have Treponema, Borrelia, and Leptospira. But I wonder why Helicobacter pylori was not included in this distinct class, even though it has a helical shape, Helicobacter pylori. But anyways, I am not in a position to question the wisdom of our older scientists. So they have decided that these three genera would be best grouped as under the Spirocatalis. So the Treponema, Borrelia, and Leptospira. Each of them cause disease among human beings. Diseases which may be considered as controversial in nature because of its kinky nature, and some of them do bring about a lot of pestilence in the population. So in general, the Spirocatalis is a large heterogeneous group of spiral-shaped motile bacteria. Okay? This bacteria is able to propel itself in the environment. Okay? There are two families falling in this group. You have the Spirocatacea and the Leptospiracea. The Spirocatacea has two genera, the Borrelia and Treponema, and Leptospiracea has one genus, Leptospira. So quite a limited number of members in this particular distinct group. Compared to your cocci and your bacillus, which is considered as a large family, especially when I'm talking about the Enterobacterialis or Enterobacteria shape. Okay? The several genera falling under that, genera belonging to that large family. Whereas for Spirochetalis, we have Spirochetasea and Leptospiracea. These three genera are considered as pathogenic. There are also other members of Spirochetalis, but they are not pathogenic to human beings. So we will no longer discuss them. So the Troponema, Borrelia, Leptospira have their own, as a genus, they have their own respective species. Troponema pallidum, subspecies pallidum, brings about syphilis. Now syphilis is one of the very commonly recognized sexually transmitted infection. Okay. And then Treponema pallidum has several subspecies. I mentioned subspecies pallidum causes syphilis, whereas subspecies endemicum causes Beggia. And then subspecies Burdenway causes Yos. And then another species of Treponema carateum, causes Pinta. Among the 4 diseases caused by Treponema, it is only syphilis that is sexually transmitted. The other 3 are non-sexually transmitted infection. So in other words, they are often transmitted through physical contact of the lesion to the skin of another individual. So it is non-sexual in nature, its transmission for Beggia, Yos, and Pinta. The second member of the spirochetes, which is Borrelia, species would include Burgdorferi, which causes Lyme disease, or also known as borreliosis, then Borrelia recurrentis, which causes epidemic relapsing fever. Whereas many species of Borrelia bring about endemic relapsing fever. Now the Lyme disease, the epidemic and endemic form of relapsing fever are transmitted with the aid of a vector. So there is an invertebrate organism that would assist in the transmission of Borrelia, which I'm going to discuss later. Leptospira has only one pathogenic species, Leptospira interrogans, which causes leptospirosis, which was a news several weeks ago here in the city. So leptospirosis is caused by Leptospira interrogans, and the severe form is the whale's disease. But it is nice to know that Leptospira also has one non-pathogenic species, and that is the Leptospira biflexa. Leptospira biflexa is a free-living, non-pathogenic Leptospira. So it does not cause disease in humans. However, its appearance is identical to that of your Leptospira interrogans, causing leptospirosis. Okay. So this table illustrates the different genera under spirochetes and their respective diseases that they cause. So let's start our discussion, or let's move with our discussion with the physical structure of the spirochetes in general. So they are described as long, thin or slender, helically coiled, spiral or corkscrew-shaped bacilli. Okay? So I think your Helicobacter pylori has only a spiral-shaped appearance. Your spirochetes may have a corkscrew-shaped morphology. So I think you're familiar with the corkscrew. The corkscrew is a household implement which is used to open wine bottles. You're familiar with that? So the corkscrew is a way in opening wine bottles. So that is the shape of the spirochetes. And the spirochetes in general have 5 parts. Okay? We have the outer sheath, made up of a glycosaminoglycan layer, followed by the outer membrane. Then the outer membrane, as shown by the schematic image over there, would be followed by the endoflagella. Now the endoflagella possesses the axial filaments, which is the source of the locomotive power of the spirochetes. And then after the endoflagella going inward outside from outward to inwards, we have the outer sheath or glycogen layer, we have the outer membrane, then we have the endoflagella or the axial filament, then we have the inner membrane, and then finally we have the cytoplasmic fibrils or tubule. So these are the 5 major physical components of the spirochetes in general. Notice it is somehow different compared to that of your cocci and the bacilli, which is the cell wall, the cell membrane, etc. And then also, the spirochetes reproduce by transverse fission. What is transverse fission? You can recall your cell biology. Transverse fission is the what? The splitting of a microorganism along its short axis or long axis. Transverse, therefore it's a cut section, therefore it is short axis. The counterpart or the opposite of your transverse fission is your longitudinal fission, which is along the longest axis of the microbe. So in spirochetes, they reproduce by dividing along its short axis, which we term as transverse fission. And then another would be your spirochetes may be aerobic, or it can also be microaerophilic. Okay, so later I'm going to tell which member of the spirochetes require abundant proportion of oxygen, and which one requires just a small quantity of oxygen. So let's start discussing now the different pathogenic members of the spirochete, starting with Treponema. Now, Treponema is a genus containing 2 species that cause disease in humans. The Treponema pallidum and Treponema paradeum. Treponema pallidum has 3 subspecies. We have Treponema pallidum, subspecies pallidum, Treponema pallidum, subspecies pertimae, and subspecies endemicum, as I have illustrated earlier in my previous slide. As I have emphasized earlier, your Treponema pallidum, subspecies pallidum, is a sexually transmitted infection. It's an STI. Therefore, it is often seen in places where there are brothels or prostitution den, or in times of war, wherein soldiers will seek the companionship of women in a foreign land. So that is one of the common scenarios how Treponema is transmitted in the population. And if I am not mistaken, they believe that certain wars in history, certain major battles in history were won because the soldiers, their armies, the armies which they thought was the armies that was sent to the front to battle against their enemies were decimated because of infection by syphilis. Okay, so syphilis is a disease which somehow figured in certain aspect in Western civilization history. If you have read annals or accounts in the Middle Ages, wars between France and Italy, they often, I think the word syphilis is already a modern term, pero before they term syphilis as a French disease or an Italian disease, depending on whose account, depending on whose account it was given, whose account it originated. So syphilis is a disease that was constantly mentioned in history. So Treponema caratium is the other species Treponema, and this would cause a skin infection and a skin disease named Pinta. Treponema pallidum subspecies pallidum is a thin spirochete, 6 to 20 microns in length, with 10 to 30 coils. Okay? It's a corkscrew motility with an undulating central flexion. So just try to think of the corkscrew that we use in opening wine bottles. That is the motion of Treponema in its native environment. Man is the only natural reservoir. So in short, Treponema pallidum or syphilis is not a disease that we can obtain from animals. It is not a zoonotic infection. It is limited only to man. Can we think of another bacteria which man is the only natural reservoir? Maybe another pathogenic organism wherein man is only reservoir would be your smallpox. But the smallpox has already been eradicated in the face of the earth, and it only remains in certain clandestine labs in, I think, in the US or in Russia. So I think syphilis is a unique kind of bacteria because man is the only organism infected by it. Transmission is by direct contact with active lesions, primarily through sexual contact. And in 10-20% of cases, the primary lesion is intrarectal, perianal, or oral. So I don't think it would be quite hard for you to realize this, that in 10% of cases, it can originate in the intrarectal, perianal, or oral. Noting that it is a sexually transmitted kind of infection. Vertical transmission across the placenta may result when either a little infected female becomes pregnant or when a pregnant woman becomes infected. And if the sexual transmission is the primary mode of spread of syphilis, vertical transmission serves as the second most common mode of transmission. And then, how do we visualize the treponemes, especially Treponema pallidum? It is the utilization of an immunofluorescent stain or a fluorescent stain alongside a special kind of microscope. It's a dark field microscope or dark field illumination, which is helpful in recognizing these spirals. Remember, these spirals are very thin. They are very thin organisms, and they are quite motile in the field of view. Hence, the light microscope would be inadequate in identifying them. Hence, the need for the need to shift to a dark field microscope in order to visualize this distinct class of bacteria. However, unfortunately, the dark field microscope is not commonly obtained by clinical labs, okay, in a general clinical lab. So therefore, our general clinical lab relies on serologic methods to identify the spirochetes. Okay. It is through serology instead of the usual visualization per naked eye. Spirochetes multiply locally at the site of entry, and some spread to nearby lymph nodes and then reach the bloodstream. Now, the Treponema do possess chemical substances that enables it to dissolve tissues at the site of inoculation or infection. And then, once these bacteria are inoculated in the site, it produces some enzymes which enable it to dissolve the ground substance in a soft tissue that will enable it now to transport itself to the lymph nodes. That's why when a person has syphilis, one has to palpate it's the inguinal lymph node because likely the inguinal lymph node is already swollen because of the natural vibration of the spirochete from the site of inoculation, particularly in the what site? In the genitals, and then later it will now is now present in the lymph nodes. Okay. And then finally, once they reach the barrier of the lymph node, then it can now gain entry to the bloodstream and now causing what? Systemic infection. And syphilis has several stages, several stages illustrating the level of spread, okay, or the extent of spread that is now undertaken. Okay. So the stages corresponds now to the extent of the dissemination of the treponeme. The first stage or the primary stage is characterized by the growth or by the eruption of a distinct skin lesion. And that lesion is the hard chancre. The hard chancre at first is a papule. A papule or like a pimple that later on will rupture, thus causing now an ulcer. Now this ulcer is often seen in the genital of the individual. So if it's a male, in the penis, and then for the female, probably in the labia. Okay? So it occurs at a median of 3 weeks, although it may be absent for some. I think it would take around 2 to 10 weeks, okay, for the spirochete to incubate or to proliferate in number, and then afterwards it will now present as a hard chancre in the primary stage. Okay? And then healing would happen anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks, and the chancre gives way to the secondary stage. In my slide, it is 2 to 8 weeks. In your textbook, it has reported there that it will take around 2 to 10 weeks for the chancre to heal and then pave the way for the secondary stage. Now, the secondary stage is characterized by the manifestation of a red maculopapular rash. So there is a rash, a reddish colored rash, okay, present any part or any site in the body, but it has a distinct preference or predilection to the hands and the feet of the victim. Okay, and then also aside from there is this maculopapular rash. When I say macule, it is a flat lesion, diba? Less than 1 cm. That is the macule. A papule is like a small bump on the surface. Okay. So that is one of the striking manifestation of syphilis during the secondary stage. Another clinical manifestation or stigmata of the secondary stage would be the emergence of the moist condyloma. This condyloma is properly termed as condyloma lata. Okay? Condyloma lata is distinct from the common wart. How do we call the common wart? The common genital wart. It is condyloma acuminata or condyloma acuminatum. So for syphilis, it is termed as condyloma lata. Now, condyloma lata only grows in sites in our body where it is warm and moist. So in one side of our body where it is warm and moist. Of course, in the genital region, diba? In the genitals. Secondly would be around the anus. And then, what else? Or where else? In the axilla or in the armpit. And finally, in the oral cavity. So these are the four sites where condyloma lata can erupt. In the genitals, in the anus, in the axilla, and in the mouth or in oral cavity. Okay. So the condyloma lata is described as a wart-like growth. It can appear as a flat top, exophytic plaque or patch in this sense, in the genital region, axilla, and the mouth. And one should not touch the condyloma lata with your bare hands because those sites are heavily infiltrated by the spirochetes. Okay? So careful, okay, in touching the chancre and in the condyloma lata. These are heavily infested by the spirochetes, treponemes, to be exact. So notice this is a picture, two pictures illustrating the hard chancre and the maculopapular rash present in the hands of the patient. Okay, so I'm not so sure if the hands and the owner of this penis is same Bereshka individual, meaning same man. So notice the nasty looking skin lesion in the shaft of the male penis. So I believe this particular skin lesion would be what? Very painful. Okay, very painful because of this very large ulcerating surface. On the contrary, this particular lesion is painless. Okay, this is a painless skin lesion, and they call this painless skin lesion, and it can heal naturally. The patient will just ignore this lesion. Thus, it will now pave the way for the secondary stage of syphilis. Okay? Because this will just heal spontaneously and it is painless. The maculopapular rash is erupted in the palm of the individual. Okay? So it's already in the secondary stage of syphilis. The first one, hard chancre in the primary stage. Okay, so in the natural progression of syphilis, the natural progression of syphilis would probably tell you that it is the expected, meaning syphilis will strictly follow, okay? Will strictly follow the progression from the primary, secondary, and napatay last katong tertiary. But according to clinical data, a person infected with syphilis may may undergo the primary stage of syphilis, and then it will no longer proceed to the secondary stage. So it will just, the chancre would heal, disappear, and then no more secondary and tertiary stage. That happens in 30% of cases. In another 30% of cases, it will move from the primary to the secondary stage. Okay. And the last would be, it can go all the way to the tertiary stage. Now the tertiary stage is the most catastrophic, the most calamitous type of, the most calamitous stage of syphilis, because in the tertiary stage, which I'm going to discuss later, is already a systemic type of syphilitic infection, now involving major organs in our body like the central nervous system and the heart. Okay, so far that is the primary and secondary stage of syphilis. And then there's also a small proportion of cases wherein there will appear in latency. Okay? In latency, the patient will not show additional manifestation of the infection, as if it did not exist, syphilis. So it will falsely cause the patient to believe that she or he is already healed or free of syphilis, even though that inside the body of the patient, the syphilitic organisms are still proliferating in numbers. So the first 4 years of this period, the latency period, may see episodes of relapse, okay, or early latent period. So in the first 4 years of this, the latency period, the patient here is highly infectious, okay? Highly infectious. But after 4 years or 5 years of syphilitic disease, syphilitic infection, the patient is no longer considered as infectious. Okay? So the chances of being infected with syphilis would be significantly diminished after 5 years. So muna siya ang latent period, and during this time, relapses will no longer happen to the patient. Okay? 1/3 of untreated patients, I mentioned earlier, 30%, develop tertiary syphilis. So in tertiary syphilis, the most serious manifestation of this disease would now take place. It's take place in the cardiovascular system and in the central nervous system. So the cardiovascular syphilis presents as a aortic aneurysm. Okay. So in here, in this particular manifestation, treponins would invade the tunica media of the aorta. The tunica media of the aorta would be what? Markedly weakened. Okay, markedly weakened. And then because of the significant weakening of the tunica media, okay, the tough wall of the aorta, it can now easily balloon, thus causing aortic aneurysm. Aside from aortic aneurysm, it can also cause aortic valve defects. Okay? So that is one of the serious morbidities of syphilitic infection now involving the heart. Meanwhile, aside from infecting the heart, it can also involve the soft tissues, okay? Such as the skin, the skeletal system, and the mucocutaneous tissue. And that granulomatous lesion of syphilis present in the soft tissue like the skin, the skeletal system, and the mucocutaneous tissue, we term that as the gomas, okay, or goma. So the goma is characterized by the upper image. Good. So there's an ulcer entering the forehead of this person. And then, because it is, di ba, it is ulcerating lesion with a erythematous edge, it is hard, but if you ask the patient if there is pain, it is still a painless skin lesion, just like the Harshanker. So this is a painless lesion in the soft tissue of a patient, the syphilitic. This one is characteristic of invasion of syphilis in the central nervous system, particularly in what organ? The spinal cord. Okay, this is the spinal cord. In the spinal cord invasion is characterized by this necrosis or degeneration in the posterior columns of the spinal cord. Okay? Because of this, there will be now interruption or disruption in the transmission of sensory impulses, okay, towards the spinal cord. So that is the one damage directed by syphilis to the central nervous system. There is this damage to the posterior column of the spinal cord. This one is characteristic of your syphilitic aortic aneurysm. Again, notice the massive ballooning of the aorta because of the weakening of the tunica media. Okay? So the patient can die if this aneurysm would eventually later on rupture or burst. So meningovascular syphilis occurs 5 to 10 years after the initial infection and clinically present as seizures, stroke, and aphasia. What is aphasia? It is the inability of the person to properly express itself. So there's now impairments in communication, in thinking, understanding, in talking. Okay? That is aphasia. Congenital syphilis may be an infantile form and a late form. Remember, vertical transmission from the placenta is the second most common mode of spread of syphilis. So naturally, congenital syphilis is can happen after the mother delivers her baby. But I think congenital syphilis is best remembered as part of a syndrome. You know what syndrome? Kanisha, kaning syphilis, in the context of newborns. Are you familiar with the Torch syndrome? Torch? Torch is a syndrome, actually an abbreviation. So T stands for toxoplasma, O stands for others, R for rubella, C cytomegalovirus, H. Can you think of a microorganism with another H? Herpes simplex. Okay, so 4 viruses. So the O, the others, is where the syphilis fall. Okay, others. So syphilis can infect newborns in an infantile form and a late form. And syphilis infection in childhood can be identified or can be recognized because it does create changes in the physical appearance of the boy or the girl, which I'm going to illustrate later. In the infantile form, a diffuse rash, osteochondritis, and periosteitis are typical. So more of damage or infection involving the bones, okay, in the infantile form. However, in the late form, we have a triad of interstitial keratitis, Hutchinson's teeth, and acoustic nerve deafness. That is the triad found in the late form of congenital syphilis. Again, interstitial keratitis, Hutchinson's teeth, and acoustic or aortic nerve deafness. If I'm not mistaken, getting into keratitis, the first one, commonly affects the eye of the patient. But I might be wrong. Pero muna ako ma-remember sa keratitis more on the eyeball damage. So whatever organ involved or whatever stage of the disease, the histologic hallmark of syphilis is an obliterative and arteritis. That is the typical histologic change that is happening in a tissue infected by syphilis. So in obliterative and arteritis, it commonly damages the blood vessels, the small blood vessels in our body. Okay. So in obliterative and arteritis, there is this concentric fibroblastic and endothelial cell proliferation. Okay? And because of that concentric, endothelial, and fibroblastic proliferation, it can now bring about some microthrombi, okay, a thrombus formation within the lumen of the blood vessel. So this image here is representative of the obliterative and arteritis typical of a syphilitic infection. Okay? So this is the vasa vasorum found in the adventitia of the aorta. Okay? So the vasa vasorum found in the adventitia of the aorta, typical of your obliterative and arteritis. This gallery here is all about the late form of congenital syphilis. Starting off with the Hutchinson's teeth. In Hutchinson's teeth, it is characterized by a damage in the dentures of the individual, characterized by widely spaced peg teeth. So maybe just think of the teeth of Pennywise, diba? The evil clown in it. So in Hutchinson's teeth, it has a jagged edge or a notch edge. So that is one feature of the late form of congenital syphilis. Diba? I'm correct. Keratitis, more of the eyeball. So there is this opacification of the cornea in the eyeball brought about by keratitis, okay? Corneal impairment. What about saddle nose? Saddle nose is just the sunken in damage to the nasal bridge. So there is this loss of height of the nasal bridge because of the destruction of the treponines to the nasal cartilage. Okay? The damage to the nasal cartilage causes the nasal bridge to collapse or to sink in, thus causing now saddle nose or frontal palsy. So these are just the physical changes happening in a person infected with syphilis. Okay? Detection either by direct visualization of the organism and material from lesions or indirectly by immunologic methods. In laboratories that do carry dark field microscope. But the dark field microscope is oftentimes seen in clinical lab. Hence, we have to rely on serologic methods I've mentioned earlier. And then also, treponines are susceptible to drying or desiccation, hot or cold temperature, and also osmotic changes to the environment. So a hot or dry environment or hot or dry temperature, drying or desiccation, osmotic changes, they can rapidly kill the spirochetes, especially if the temperature would rise to around 42 degrees Celsius. So more than the more than the highest value in our standard thermometer, the old mercury thermometer. So beyond 42 degrees centigrade. And then the cerebrospinal fluid is useful for the VDRL testing. The VDRL is a non-troponemal test used to diagnose or used to detect treponins, syphilis. So the CSF fluid is useful for the VDRL testing because, as mentioned, the tertiary stage of syphilis is happening in the central nervous system. So therefore, neurosyphilis is characteristic of that final stage. So let's proceed to the diagnostic tests used to detect syphilis. There are two major classes of diagnostic tests for syphilis. We have the non-troponemal and the troponemal test. So let's start with the non-troponemal test. These tests are used to screen for the disease and to monitor the course of the disease post-treatment. So in general, these are just screening tests for syphilis. The standard tests include the VDRL reagent slide, rapid plasma reagent, the RPR, rapid plasma reagent circle card, unheated serum reagent or USR, and the toluidine red unheated serum for the trust. Okay. So just try to familiarize yourself with the different tests falling under non-troponemal test. So these are just screening tests for syphilis. Dili is siya confirmatory. It is the troponemal that is confirmatory. They can give quantitative results using serial two-fold dilution, and quantitative results are valuable in finding a diagnosis and evaluating the effect of treatment. So we can use the non-troponemal test to check whether that person is responding to treatment for syphilis. The good thing in managing patient with syphilis is that since the genome of the syphilitic organism is conserved, when we say conserved, dili mag-alter ang composition of the genome of syphilis among the different strains. Treatment for syphilis is still the classic penicillin, which I'm going to discuss later. So in here, in the non-troponemal test, we can use this to see whether the patient is responding well to penicillin. Naman siya expected duration. Expected duration for the treatment of syphilis. Kung at the end of the treatment period, and then we check whether the patient is completely cured of syphilis, we can use the non-troponemal test to see whether there is response to the antibiotic. Okay, one of the purpose for the non-troponemal test, to see whether the patient has responded to the treatment against syphilis, which is penicillin. The VDRL test is standardized for use on CSF, and the result becomes positive in patient with neurosyphilis. So we can rephrase this as the VDRL test is the best test to detect for neurosyphilis. Okay? Pero other form of syphilis, dili recommended rather ang VDRL. Okay? So what is this test? Are you familiar with this test? This is the RPR, or rapid plasma reagent card test. Then we have the VDRL reagents. Then we have another RPR card. Now, reagent, di ba, kay blood plasma reagent. Reagent is actually a kind of antibody. It's an antibody-like agent that is produced by the body whenever the patient is infected with the syphilitic organism. Now, the reagent will combine with the bacterial antigen. Okay? So, naa siya yung mga form ng complex. Okay? In RPR, this test is the end result. Okay? The end result of the RPR or rapid plasma reagent test is the detection of what? Detection of floc or flocculation. So there should be, what is flocculation, by the way? Flocculation can be thought of as agglomeration or coagulation or clumping. So there should be clumping present within the circle of this card. Because naturally, the antigens, the lipid antigens, present themselves as granules or particles. Particles that are dispersed individually in the environment. With the introduction of reagent, this reagent will now bring about a formation of a complex. Thus, it will form these clumps or aggregates, which can now be visualized. In RPR, we can visualize this using our naked eye. Why is it? Because there seems to be a colored material introduced in the particles. This colored material in the particles, once they combine, enables us to see them using our naked eye. Hence, circle number 2 and number 3. 2 and 3 are reactive. Okay? Thus, positive siya for the RPR test. For your BDRL, the BDRL still utilizes the principle of flocculation, but BDRL requires you to see them using a microscope. So microscopic examination is necessary for the BDRL test. While your RPR, we can see them using our naked eye. And the end result here is just the clumping or agglomeration. Okay. On the other hand, the troponemal test detects the presence of antibodies to troponemal antigens and are used to confirm a positive non-troponemal screening test, the previous that I mentioned, or to confirm infection in the face of a negative non-troponemal test in the late or latent disease. Again, to confirm a positive non-troponemal screening test or to confirm infection in the face of a negative non-troponemal test in the late or latent disease. Okay? That is the rationale for the troponemal test. Why is it that the troponemal test should not be used as screening test for syphilis? Because the troponemal test, once it is positive, the patient has positive results, it cannot tell us if that infection is really active or current, or it is just a past infection. So we don't know if the patient is actively infected with syphilis or it's just a naayon na siya, but naayon na siya and the positive result is just a result of a previous infection. That is the rationale why the troponemal test is not to be used as screening test for syphilis. Whereas your treponemal test tells us that it's an active infection of syphilis. Okay. Example of the treponemal test would include your TPPA, or treponema pallidum particle agglutination, which is the most common or the most frequent treponemal test in the United States. The TPHA, or treponema pallidum hemagglutination, and the MHATP, or the microhemagglutination treponema pallidum, are based on the same principle as this one, the TPPA, but uses the SHE-RBC. Okay? So, one difference lang sa treponema pallidum hemagglutination and the microhemagglutination treponema pallidum versus that of the treponema pallidum particle agglutination. So, lahihan ang the RBR flocculation ng treponema. Your TPPA agglutination, but already in the treponema test. So this is more of the confirmatory test na for syphilis. Okay. In my experience, the treponemal test is often requested by mga OBGYN, especially if their patients turns out to be positive sa VDRL. So the obstetrician would be motivated to proceed to the treponemal test because of the risk of infection by the fetus or unborn child with syphilis. Okay? So ma-avoid ang obstetrician na ang baby would contract congenital syphilis. And then finally, we have the FDA-ABS, or fluorescent treponemal antibody absorb test. Treponemal antibody test used for many years. Okay, this is the more common treponemal test, okay, used for many years. So let's proceed to the treatment for syphilis. So syphilis is treated by a single injection of benzathine penicillin G, 2.4 million units intramuscularly. It is the drug of choice for syphilis. But it is more applicable sa primary stage, primary and secondary. For those patients already in the latent or in the tertiary stage, we need to add more penicillin. So for those type of patient, we can give 3 doses of penicillin, 3 doses weekly. Okay? 3 doses of penicillin G weekly for patients already in the latent or in the tertiary stage of the disease. And then be wary of the Jarek-Schurz hyperreaction. The Jarek-Schurz hyperreaction is just the worsening condition of the patient. Okay? Worsening condition of the patient brought about by the imminent death of the syphilitic organism. So when the treponins die, their death will bring about toxic products to the body. And these toxic products will make the patient look serious or morbid, and that phenomenon is what we term as the Jarek-Schurz hyperreaction. Okay. This is a picture of the Jarek-Schurz hyperreaction. Notice the profuse rash that is present in the body of this patient, brought about by the death of the treponema pallidum microorganisms. Okay. This is an illustration of the immunofluorescent antibody test, okay, used to detect syphilis. Okay? This is the direct fluorescent antibody test. So the green or neon green organisms, this is representative of the Treponema pallidum subspecies pallidum. Okay. The second disease under Treponema wolbeius are caused by Treponema pallidum subspecies vertebrae, distributed in the tropical areas around the world, often seen in prepubescent to adolescent persons, and it presents as a papule turning into a wart-like lesion in the lower limbs as the person ages. So Yos is a skin lesion presenting as a wart, and the victims here are oftentimes children living in tropical areas in the world. So tropical areas, mga warm and humid countries. And then we have endemic syphilis, also known as Begel. It's a non-venereal lesion of Treponema pallidum subspecies endemico, as similar to Yos in hot areas in the Middle East and in Africa. And it presents as a mucous patch called diloma lata, just like in syphilis. Angular stomatitis, generalized lymphadenopathy, and painful osteoperiosteitis. Notice medyo similar siya ang manifestation with syphilis, but wala siya hard chancre. Hard chancre is unique to venereal syphilis. Okay. And then finally, Pinta. Pinta again is called Treponema caratio. Endemic in rural, tropical, Central and South America, even here in our country. So, Treponema caratio is also endemic in the Philippines. And clinical manifestation of Pinta would be, it starts as a primary papule or a plaque in the soft tissue parts in our body. And then the primary papule or the plaque would eventually what? Would it spontaneously progress to the secondary lesion, just like in syphilis? No. The primary papule or plaque will eventually heal, just like the hard chancre. Later on, it will give a false belief the patient na ayaw na siya. But actually, the organism is still proliferating inside the body, and then several years later, there will be a secondary lesion or the pintates that will grow at the site where the primary papule or plaque originally erupted. Okay? And then once the pintates are already present in the body of the patient, it will now become chronic. It will not easily go away, just like the primary papule. And then later on, at first, kaning pintates, it is hyperchromatic. So naa siya darkening. But later on, there will be hypopigmentation at the skin, and then there will be atrophy of the skin, and there will be hyperkeratosis or thickening of the skin surface. So naa siya change in color. From dark colored, especially in dark skinned persons, maklaro din siya, siya kanang itong what do you call that? Pero siya vitiligo. Na siya change in color. From a dark colored lesion to a light colored lesion. That is the pintates. Here's a table, rather a gallery, showing to you the non-venereal type of syphilis. Picture A is characteristic of the primary Yos. Okay? The wart-like lesion that is erupted in the foot of this patient. Okay? This is the primary Yos with a wart-like lesion. And then, this image on the right side, letter B, is the secondary or diffuse papillomatosis in Yos. So this is just a progression of the Yos from the foot to the upper back have a secondary use or disseminated use. Again, still it presents as a papilloma or a wart at the back of this young child. This one, letter C, is characteristic of the vegel, okay? Or the primary vegel. The vegel here has erupted as a mucosal plaque in the oral cavity of the patient. This is the primary vegel. Okay? This one is the secondary vegel, characterized by a destructive change happening now in the nasal bridge of the patient, the forehead, and parts of the face. Okay? So this is the disseminated vegel. Okay? This one is the primary pendids. Okay? It presents as a plaque. Okay? A plaque arising on the surface of the foot of this patient. Originally, the color of the plaque is brown, but later, in the secondary pendids, this is the achromic type, wherein there is loss of pigment of the plaque. Okay? This is primary and this is secondary pendids. Okay? So we have the yos, the vegel, and the pinna. Okay? Any questions for treponema? So the treatment for the non-venereal type of treponema, the Carnation, Pertenue, and the third one is still penicillin, just like in syphilis. Okay? So let's proceed to Borrelia. Now Borrelia is has a more complicated taxonomy. Multiple pathogenic and non-pathogenic species from two clades, the Lyme borreliosis group and the relapsing fever group. So the relapsing fever group contains a variety of species that can be isolated from argacid or soft ticks. We have the exodid or hard ticks and the body louse or carrying Borrelia recurrentis. So in syphilis, it doesn't have a vector, but for Borrelia, it utilizes invertebrates, the ticks, louse, okay, to effect a disease in the patient. But it's easy to remember because you only have two major classes of Borrelia. You have the Lyme borreliosis and the relapsing fever group, characterized by the Borrelia recurrentis. Okay? The organisms of Borrelia form regular spirals, 10 to 30 microns long and 0.3 microns wide. They're highly flexible and move by rotation and by twisting. Di na siya paratong corkscrew motility in syphilis. It's just rotation and by torsion or twisting. The Borrelia species exhibit a host of immunogenic proteins on their outer membrane surface, and many species can be grown from artificial media. Again, is another distinguishing feature separating it from treponema, because treponema or treponemes are very difficult to grow in artificial media. There is no culture media capable of allowing the growth of treponema. But for Borrelia, it can be grown. Okay? Relapsing fever is divided into two entities in general. We have the epidemic and the endemic. The epidemic is facilitated by the human body louse, or the pediculus humanus. So it occurs worldwide, reflecting the ubiquitous distribution of pediculus humanus, or the body louse, especially in areas where poverty is very rampant. There is lack of hygiene in a community. So that's why epidemic or louse or relapsing fever can easily be transmitted in those impoverished sites because of lack of proper hygiene and poor communities. Meanwhile, your endemic or tick-borne relapsing fever has a limited distribution and is transmitted by Argacid ordinatorous ticks. So it requires the help of the soft ticks, the ordinatorous species ticks. Okay? Can you identify the organism? This one is representative of the Pediculus humanus corporis, or the human body louse. Okay? This one is the tick, okay? Or Exodes scapularis. I think the louse has a more soft body, while the tick has a this one deer tick has a more rigid body. Okay. So the relapsing fever is endemic in many parts of the world. Its main reservoir is the rats, which serves as a source of infection for ordinatorous species ticks. Okay. In the tick, Borrelia species may be transmitted transvirally from one generation to the next. So therefore, the bacteria can infect the ovary. Thus, whatever egg it produces has already been infected by the Borrelia bacteria. So that is the risk in the endemic form of Borrelia because of transovarial dissemination and infection. The incubation period is 3 to 10 days, and the onset is sudden with chills and a fever persisting for 3 to 5 days, and then declines, leaving the patient weak. The after-prime period lasts for 4 to 10 days and is followed by a second attack of chills, fever, intense headache, and malaise. Okay. Notice, di ba, medyo difference sa iyang manner presentation of relapsing fever. In Borrelia relapsing fever, we have the febrile stage and the afebrile stage. Why is it called relapsing fever? It is called relapsing fever is because the patient infected Borrelia will undergo a certain period wherein temperature of the patient would spike, would increase around 39 to 40 degrees. That febrile period coincides with the proliferation of Borrelia in the bloodstream. Okay? At the same time, there's also massive influx of antibody in the system. Okay? That would say cocktail of the Borrelia bacteria and the antibody will last for 3 to 5 days. And the patient in this time frame would have high fever, chills, body malaise. Okay? But later on, after 5 days, that fever would subside, and the what they call this, the reduction of the temperature and improve clinical manifestation of the patient coincides now with the destruction of the Borrelia organism. Okay? That's why it becomes afebrile. However, it doesn't mean na wala na yun ang Borrelia in the system. It's just that the Borrelia is now thinking of another way to transform itself, to make another variant or copy of itself. And when the bacteria thinks of another copy, it will now again proliferate in number, and thus the patient's body will again produce a lot of antibody. Thus, the patient will now undergo another febrile stage. So there is this recurring fever and recurring febrile and afebrile stage because of this. multiplication of antigenic variants against which the host must then develop new antibodies. So this will last for 3 to 10 times. Okay? This proliferation of new variants and then destruction of the said variants, and then later on formation of a new variant and destruction of the said variants. This will last for 3 to 10 times. And this causes now the relapsing fever. Fatal cases show Labrys spirochetes in the spleen and the liver, necrotic foci in solid organs, and hemorrhage in the kidneys and the GIT. So these spirochetes can gain access to the bloodstream, thus it can invade the liver and the spleen, causing now necrosis in those sites. Okay? So I hope you can remember now the pathogenesis of the relapsing fever. Okay? So the process will be repeated several times. Okay, because of the capability of the Borrelia bacteria to make another copy or another variant of itself. Okay, it refuses to die initially. It will test the patients of the body to form another batch of antibodies to kill it off, thus causing now the recurrence of the said infection or relapsing fever. Diagnosis is best done by obtaining thick and thin blood smears like malaria and staining them with right or GEMS stain. Borrelia organisms may be visualized in wet mounts using a dark field microscopy. Okay. So since they are very delicate looking, they have to be observed using a dark field microscope. Patients with epidemic or louse-borne kind may develop a positive VDRL test result. So one has to be aware of this because this cross-reactivity, okay, of the epidemic louse-borne Borrelia antigens with a VDRL test intended only for Treponema organism. Okay? So na cross-reactivity with another class of spirochete, the Borrelia microorganism. So here is a gallery showing to you the dark field image of the Borrelia microorganism. Okay? So it is spiral shape, and it can also be seen in the peripheral blood smears. Okay? Notice they don't invade the red blood cells, no? Unlike that of malaria, where it is found inside the RBC. The Borrelia, they just lie on top or on the side of the RBC. They don't invade inside the RBC. Okay. The great variability of the remission of relapsing fever makes the evaluation of chemotherapeutic efficacy very challenging. But we can prescribe antibiotics like tetracycline, erythromycin, and penicillin for patients with Borrelia relapsing fever. But prevention is based on avoidance of exposure to ticks and lice and on delousing. So if you wish to venture into the woods, especially if you have been invited by your relative living in the US, you've been given a free ticket to visit the Great American Outdoors in the US. And then you are in all of the splendor of the mountains, the trees, the pine and the oaks in the US mainland. One has to be conscious of the Borrelia. Therefore, you have to ask whether the place that you are visiting is endemic with Borrelia, in order to protect yourself get infected by the bite of the ticks and the louse. And finally, delousing. So delousing, you have to ensure that you observe hygiene. Okay? Dapat your body must be clean all the time para dili ka easily bitten by the ticks and the louse. Okay? The second disease under this genus rather is the Lyme disease. The most common tick-borne illness in North America and Europe. It is caused by Borrelia burgdorferi in the US, Borrelia mayoli in the upper Midwestern United States, and the Borrelia apzelli and Borrelia carini in Europe and in Asia. Okay? So these are just preferred. These are just specific Borrelia species specific to a particular location in the world. The spirochetes are transmitted to the human bloodstream by the bite of various species of ticks, such as in the northeast US, Ixodes scapularis or Ixodes damini in some literature. In the western US, we have Ixodes pacificus, and in Europe, Ixodes ricinus. So the image I showed you earlier, dapat galing sa Manilaus, that particular tick is the one responsible for the Lyme borreliosis. The Ixodes scapularis or Ixodes damini. Okay. Ticks pick up Borrelia during a blood meal of a deer or other infected animals. And Ixodes scapularis mainly feeds on white-tailed deer and white-footed mouse, especially in areas of tall grass, and is most active in summertime. So in the US, when is summer in the US? Around May to July. May to July. So, one siya ka months na one has to be wary in venturing into the woods, especially if that area is known to be endemic of Lyme borreliosis. But it is not the adult form of the tick. It is prone to bite human beings. It is the larva and the nymphal stages are more likely to bite humans, okay? Especially during summertime. So most exposures are in May through July. Okay? May to July for the nymph. But for the larva, kaning larva is marami siya gonna be the older stage. They usually bite August to September. Okay, ang larva. The transmission of Borrelia burgdorferi to humans is by injection of the organism in tick saliva or by regurgitation of the tick's midgut contents. So it is by inoculating the organism through its saliva when it bites, or iyang isuka ang iyang kikaon when it bites. Okay? Regurgitation. That is the mode of transmission of Borrelia into the body of the patient. Borrelia burgdorferi. The organism adheres to the proteoglycans of host cells. This is mediated by Borrelia glycosaminoglycan receptor. Okay? Probably found in the outer sheath. Okay? After injection or after the biting of the tick, the bacteria egresses from the site, producing a characteristic skin lesion. When we say egress, wala siyang hawak pa. It will depart from the site where it has been introduced. Okay? And that migration from the bite site causes now a distinct skin lesion, which we term as, literally siya, erythema migrans. Kaya nag-migrate siya from the site of inoculation. Lyme disease often progresses in 3 stages. So in Borrelia burgdorferi infection, the first stage is notable for a circular rash, which we term as erythema migrans, in a bullseye pattern that appears after the bite. So the bullseye pattern, how do we describe bullseye? So there is this round circle na colored red, and then there's a center na kind of pale. Okay. So that's what ano siya ang erythema migrans, or the bullseye pattern in the primary or the first stage of Borrelia burgdorferi infection. The rash is often accompanied by flu-like symptoms like headache, fatigue, chills, anorexia, and fever. So I think you're familiar sa ng flu. Okay? So this is also found in the primary or the first stage of Lyme disease or Borrelia burgdorferi infection. So mali siya ang they call this erythema migrans. Okay? Notice na siya erythema center, but there's this pale area in between the outer reddish ring and the central and the center. Okay? So this is characteristic of your erythema migrans. It tells us that this one is the site of the bite of the tick, and then the organism has not traveled at this point in the body of the patient. So this is erythema migrans in the primary stage. Here's a light cycle illustration of the Lyme borreliosis or Lyme disease. So number one, the adult tick, okay, so this tick female will drop off host to lay eggs. Then later the eggs will hatch. Okay, will hatch and will give rise to six-legged larvae. This larva will now infect rodents or rats, okay, as the first host, and they will now acquire Borrelia burgdorferi. Later on, the larva in the body of in the skin of the rat or the mouse will molt into nymph after leaving the first host. And then, after molting, it will now again search and attach itself to a second host and again acquire Borrelia burgdorferi. Later on, there will be another round of molting by the nymph. And then, after molting, it again leaves the second host, and this time it will now infect the white-tailed deer. Wala na siya yung final niya na stop. Okay? So adults attach itself to the third host, to the white-tailed deer, for feeding and mating, and then the cycle repeats itself again. Okay? That is the life cycle of your Lyme borreliosis. So it needs two hosts. Okay? We have the first host, the second host, and then finally we have the third host. And the third one is now the deer. The secondary stage of the disease, if it happens, is indicated by vibrating arthritic pain and by disturbances of memory, vision, or movement. And the third stage is marked by worsening arthritis and by neurological stigmata that is likened to those of multiple sclerosis. Okay? I mentioned here it happens because pwede siya na infection by Lyme borreliosis stops at the primary stage. Pwede na nandito siya putok sa erythema migrans. And it will not proceed anymore to the secondary stage. Pero there are also cases wherein it will go all the way to the last stage, just like in syphilis. The final stage or the third stage where it will now resemble that of multiple sclerosis. What is multiple sclerosis, by the way? Are you familiar with this condition? It's a neurologic disorder. Okay? A neurologic disorder characterized by what? Visual disturbance. So, mara siya kakalibat. Blurring of vision. That's one. Visual disturbance. Second would be, there would be numbing. Okay, numbing or loss of sensation in the body of the patient. And third, the patient will now what? Impairment in the sense of balance or movement. So, wala na siya kakatumba. Dili siya maka-walk properly because of disturbance in balance. Parang ganyan nagyapan siya, di ba? Memory, vision, and movement in the in multiple sclerosis. Serology has been the mainstay for diagnosis of Lyme disease. The EIA, or the enzyme immunoassay, or ELISA, and the IFA, or the indirect fluorescent antibody, are the most widely used initial tests for Lyme disease. Okay? So the ELISA and the indirect fluorescent antibody. The immunoblock assay is generally performed to confirm results obtained by the EIA test. So, kung positive siya for EIA, one has to proceed to the immunoblock assay. But you should not indiscriminately request for EIA and IFA in a place not really endemic for Lyme borreliosis. Okay? One has to correlate the results of the patient with the clinical manifestation and clinical history. Because there are cases na false positive result. Okay? So one has to correlate it with the clinical history of the patient to arrive at the correct diagnosis of Lyme borreliosis. Okay? So the PCR assay has been applied to detection of Borrelia DNA in many body fluids. It is rapid, sensitive, and specific, but it does not differentiate between DNA from a live or a living Borrelia burgdorferi strain, an active disease, and a DNA from a dead organism in treated or inactive disease. So the problem now with PCR is it won't tell us whether the patient has an active infection or maybe just a case of a past infection. It is crucial because we did not give antibiotics to a patient na na-cured na siya of a disease. Di ba? Kaya that would be uneconomical. So PCR won't allow us to differentiate whether it is an active infection versus that of a past or a past infection. It grows most readily in a BSK2 culture media, okay, the Barbour Stony Kelly medium, especially when the patient is still at the primary stage or the initial stage, characterized by the erythema migrans skin lesion. So, how do we treat a patient with Lyme borreliosis? We give doxycycline, amoxicillin, or cefuroximazepine for 2 to 3 weeks. That is the standard treatment guideline for persons having or infected with Lyme borreliosis. Okay. Doxycycline, amoxicillin, and cefuroximazepine for 2 to 3 weeks. Here is an actual image of the BSK or Barbour Stony Kelly media. Here are the colonies of your Borrelia, and the colonies are easily identified because it has been enhanced by the presence of the FLAG promoter. So this is a enhancement nutrient in order for the colonies to be easily identified or to stand out, become prominent in the Petri dish. That is the Barbour Stony Kelly 2 media that will enable the growth of your Borrelia. Prevention is based on the avoidance of exposure to ticks. Wearing long sleeves and long pants tucked into socks is recommended, especially when one is walking or strolling in the woods, okay? Especially during the summertime. Environmental control of ticks using application of insecticides has provided modest success. So in other words, dili kayo effective ang ticks. So this statement here still holds on to the age-old principle that prevention is better than cure. Okay? wearing long sleeves and long pants. Any question for Borrelia? Okay. Lyme disease is termed as such because its first case was noted in a town in Connecticut, and that town is Lyme. That's why it is called as Lyme disease. Okay. In microbiology, there are names of bacteria that has been lifted from places where they were first discovered. Diba? So, paning Lyme disease, ikani siya sa Old Lyme, a small town in Connecticut, USA. Okay. The first reported case of Lyme borreliosis. Okay. The last genus which I'm going to talk about is the Leptospira. And I think this particular genus has been in the news in the recent months. There are 18 genomic species, many containing both pathogenic and non-pathogenic strains, and over 260 serobars or strains of Leptospira. Leptospira is a zoonotic infection. It is unique compared to your Borrelia and Treponema because Leptospira, its behavior is similar to what? Can you think of an example of a zoonotic infection? What is zoonosis, by the way? Zoonosis. Okay, it's a disease which can be a disease from an animal that can be transmitted to human being. That is zoonosis. Can you think of a disease? Can you think of a disease? Because as an example of a zoonosis, which is the most recent one. Right? So COVID-19 is also. I'm not so sure about Yersinia pestis. COVID-19 is a very good example of a zoonosis. Another example of a zoonosis is the one I have just explained to you several weeks ago. That is the typhoid fever. No? Your salmonella. Your salmonella infects your dogs, cats, turtles, cows, chicken. But it can also infect us, human beings. So, salmonella, COVID-19 are two examples of a zoonotic infection. It is carried by rodents and feral and domestic animals, yet the black rat is an important source of infection in man. So, black rats they really are carriers of human diseases, black rats. So here's an AI image of Leptospira, spiral shape. They look like your telephone cords, diba? The old landline telephone, diba? So ano siya ay yung Leptospira. And then this is a drawing illustrating how Leptospira, a Leptospira organism would get inside the body of a human being. Notice that the black rat here at the foreground of this image has urinated in a pool of water or in a lake. And then that urine has slowly spread into the pool where a young child is learning how to swim. Okay? So in Leptospira, our leptospirosis, the mode of transmission is ingestion of contaminated urine, congestion of water contaminated by the urine of rats, or exposure of an open wound to a water contaminated by the urine of a black rat. Okay? That is the mode of transmission of leptospirosis. But it's more of the exposure to an open wound. So leptospires are tightly coiled with hook ends, 0.1 microns in width and 6 to 20 microns in length, and demonstrate a spinning motility. Okay, laylay, di ba? Dwarf screw for Claponema, rotational for Borrelia, and spinning motility for Leptospira. They're actively motile, which is best seen using, again, a dark field microscope. After entering into the circulation, they spread widely, including into the central nervous system and the eye. And the organs where they cause serious damage would be your liver, the kidneys, and your blood vessels. So it's anticipated that the hepatocellular, renal tubular, and endothelial damage is anticipated after Leptospira infection. What could be the reason why they tend to attack the liver, the kidney, and the blood vessels for leptospirosis? The reason is still unknown, but they believe that it is immune mediated. So, could be antigen-antibody complexes at play in leptospirosis. Lung congestion and edema, alveolar hemorrhage, pleural effusion, and occasional hyaline membrane formation may occur in leptospirosis. So aside from the liver and the kidney, they can also cause diffuse alveolar damage. Okay, alveolar damage in this particular condition or medical disease. Leptospirosis is biphasic. When they say biphasic, there are two stages of the disease. Beginning after incubation period of 2 to 20 days, with the abrupt appearance of chills, fever, headache, muscle pain, back pain, abdominal pain, anorexia, nausea, and vomiting. Notice, diba, the manifestation are non-specific. Diba? This can be present in another infectious disease. But that's why one has to make a very good clinical history in order to arrive at a more appropriate working impression. Like asking the patient whether the workplace of the patient or the house where the patient lives is infested by rats, okay? Or whether the person lives in a poor community. Okay? So one has to make a good clinical history. The first phase is the bacteremic phase, lasting 4 to 7 days, and while dissemination of bacteria occurs in this particular phase. Okay? Bacteremic phase. The second would be the immune phase, lasting for 3 days, follows, which is characterized by the appearance of antibodies to the organism and chances of meningitis, uveitis, rash, and hepatic and renal damage. So it's in the immune phase where there is serious morbidity and probably mortality occurring in the patient. Again, there are two phases for leptospirosis. One is the bacteremic phase, lasting 4 to 7 days. Second one is the immune phase, lasting for those 3 days. And then there's a distinct serovar, autumnalis, okay? Leptospira interrogans autumnalis, and this disease, the fourth brag fever, wherein the patient will tend to manifest with a pretibial rash. Okay, so there's a rash happening in the legs, characteristic of the serovar Leptospira interrogans autumnalis, or the fourth brag fever. Okay, so here is a illustration of the stigmata of leptospirosis. So there's a rash present on the skin of the patient, and there is a conjunctival suffusion. So it seems that the blood vessels in the conjunctiva of the patient are very sensitive or very delicate. That's why the blood vessels can easily rupture and leak, causing now redness in the eyeball. So there's conjunctival effusion. Aside from that, there's also pain in the calf of the patient. Where's the calf? In the leg of the patient. Okay. There are some of the physical manifestation of a patient with leptospirosis. But dili siya ang pinaka-worst manifestation. It is the damage to the liver, characterized by jaundice, and then kidney damage. These are the more severe damage caused by leptospirosis. The ecteric phase and a severe form of leptospirosis is classically known as the Weil's disease. In here, the two phases merge. So, sa ito mga phase gani for leptospirosis? Okay. Persistent with high fever, jaundice, and bleeding, and by oliguric renal failure. So there is this increasing creatinine levels in the patient in the ecteric phase of leptospirosis, characterized by the diagnosis Weil's disease. Mortality has been seen to be 5-10% with the ecteric phase. So do not underestimate leptospirosis when it's already reached the ecteric phase or the Weil's disease form, because mortality can happen in this patient. Or potential mortality, it will become chronic. It will last for several months. The problem with a disease that becomes chronic, sooner or later, the kidney will really undergo chronic renal failure. So one has to avoid reaching this phase. The diagnosis of leptospirosis in most cases is confirmed serologically. So Leptospira is hard to grow in a culture media in general. Where we have one specific culture media, we have the EMJH. The EMJH, the semi-solid culture media, which we can use to allow the growth of Leptospira. However, the growth of Leptospira in a semi-solid culture media can only be accomplished in a reference laboratory. Why? Because it's very hard for the organism to grow. Okay? Na siya ay specific na requirement. That's why it has to be done in a reference laboratory. And then, another serologic test, or the serologic test that is best to confirm Leptospira infection is the microscopic agglutination test, the MAT test, which uses antigen from live bacteria. It is the established serologic reference method to diagnose leptospirosis. Again, for leptospirosis, we can use a culture media, the EMJH, and then the microscopic agglutination test. Okay? So which one is the EMJH and which one is the MAT? Of course, this one is the MAT, or the microscopic agglutination test. It uses immunofluorescence to visualize the spiral-shaped leptospira, okay, under dark field microscopy. Meanwhile, the picture on the right side, this is a EMJH, or the Elinghausen, McCullough, Johnson, Harris semi-solid culture media. So it's not the typical agar plate, no? Naligin siya and then colonies would grow on the surface. Rather, it is a tube, a semi-solid culture media. And then, as I have mentioned in the beginning of my lecture, diba, spirochetes have a certain requirement for oxygen. They can be microaerophilic or they can be aerobic. How do we categorize leptospira? Are they microaerophilic or they're aerobic? They are oxygen-loving bacteria. So, since they're oxygen-loving, they're aerobic, therefore, the leptospires would preferentially grow at the surface of the tube, where it is fully exposed to ambient oxygen. But later on, the bacteria or leptospires would seek an area in the tube where oxygen tension would be optimal. They will later realize that oxygen tension is not best at the surface of the semi-solid culture media, but rather at an area just below the surface. And when they found that particular area, they will now form this one, this opaque ring-shaped growth, an area just below the surface. And that opaque ring-shaped growth is what we term as the Dinger's ring. So the Dinger's ring is this opaque, white, cloud-like growth of leptospires at the area just below the surface of that EMJH culture media. Okay, so we have to wait for 9 days so that we can appreciate the Dinger's ring. This is the Dinger's ring. This is the site of maximal or optimum oxygen tension for the leptospires to grow in the semi-solid culture media. Treatment for leptospirosis should be with oral doxycycline, ampicillin, or amoxicillin. For moderate or severe disease, one must give intravenous penicillin or ampicillin. We can also give doxycycline 200 milligrams orally once weekly during heavy exposure as prophylaxis. I can recall during the time 2011 when there was this tropical storm Sindong that has swept the city of Ayerniboro, and then there was this community living in the river banks along the Cagayan River. So there were communities there that were swept away, or their bodies were fully covered by mud. They were given doxycycline as prophylaxis against leptospirosis because of becoming calamity. Okay, so this is the treatment for leptospirosis. Pre-exposure antibiotic prophylaxis is not routinely recommended. However, in those individuals who intend to visit highly endemic areas and are likely to get exposed, we have to give doxycycline 200 milligrams once weekly to begin 1 to 2 days before exposure and continue throughout the period of exposure. So, this is the rationale for giving doxycycline as prophylaxis in areas endemic for leptospirosis. Currently, there is no recommended pre-exposure prophylaxis that is safe for pregnant and lactating women. Maybe because it can be teratogenic, meaning it can cause problem defects to the unborn child. So that's why prophylaxis is recommended for pregnant and lactating women. And then for post-exposure prophylaxis, meaning for those persons who have been suspected to be exposed to rat urine, if the exposure is considered as low risk, meaning there's single history of wading in a flood or contaminated water without wounds, cuts or open lesions on the skin, we can give doxycycline 200 milligrams single dose within 24 to 72 hours from exposure. Again, single history of wading in a flood or contaminated water, but the skin is generally intact. So we can give doxycycline 200 milligrams single dose. For moderate risk, similar with a low risk exposure, but this time there is presence of wounds, cuts, or open lesions of the skin. Okay? Or if there is no open wound, ingestion of contaminated water. So nakainom siya of flood water, probably laced with rat urine. So we categorize it as moderate risk exposure. And we give doxycycline 200 milligrams once daily for 3 to 5 days to be started within 24 to 72 hours from exposure. Okay? That is the prophylaxis for moderate risk exposure. And finally, high risk exposure, if continuous exposure with or without wounds, cuts, or open lesions on the skin, swimming in flood waters, especially in urban areas infested with domestic or sewer rats, or ingestion of contaminated water. So we give doxycycline 200 milligrams once weekly until the end of exposure. So in order to properly stratify the patient as low, moderate, or high risk, one has to do a very good clinical history. One has to make a good